I always thought family meant unconditional love until I found myself staring at my parents' desperate text message on my phone while their retirement fund transfer request for $175,000 sat unopened in my email. The same parents who had drained my college fund to pay for my sister's wedding now needed my financial rescue after writing me out of their will entirely. Funny how life comes full circle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The notification chimed as I was finishing my presentation for tomorrow's client meeting. Director of Operations at Helios Architecture wasn't just a title I'd earned. It represented 8 years of relentless work, student loans I'd finally paid off last year, and countless weekends sacrificed while my peers enjoyed their 20s. At 34, I had built a life completely on my own terms. I glanced at my phone, expecting a message from Ryan about our dinner plans. Instead, my mother's name appeared on the screen, something that had become increasingly rare over the far past 5 years. Olivia, please call when you get this. It's important. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, debating how to respond. Our last conversation 3 months ago had been painfully brief, mostly updates about my sister Madeline's growing family and their new vacation property in Vermont. My own news, a promotion that nearly doubled my salary, had been acknowledged, with a distracted, "That's nice, dear." I set the phone down and returned to my presentation, the familiar ache of being an afterthought settling in my chest. This dynamic wasn't new. Throughout childhood, Madeline had been the golden child, her dance recitals warranting elaborate celebrations, her B+ grades earning effusive praise, while my academic scholarships and art competition wins were mentioned in passing, if at all. Working late again? Ryan appeared at my office door, coat in hand. As the architectural firm's lead sustainability engineer, he understood my dedication to the job. What had started as professional respect had evolved into a relationship that felt more supportive than anything I'd known in my family home. "Just finishing up," I said, saving my files. "My mother texted, says it's important." Ryan's expression softened. He knew how complicated my family relationships were. "Want me to wait?" "No need. I'll meet you at the restaurant in 30. After he left, I picked up my phone and called my mother. She answered on the first ring. "Olivia, thank our goodness. Is this a good time to talk?" "I have a few minutes. What's going on?" Her voice sounded strained. "Your father and I are facing some financial difficulties. The investments we made for retirement haven't performed as expected, and there have been some unexpected medical expenses." I leaned back in my chair, suddenly alert. My parents had always projected financial stability. My father had worked as a bank manager for 30 years before retiring 5 years ago, and they owned their house outright, a sprawling colonial in Newton that had appreciated considerably since they'd purchased it in the early 90s. "What kind of difficulties?" I asked, professional instincts kicking in. She sighed heavily. "We may need to sell the house. Your father's heart condition required procedures that weren't fully covered by insurance, and our investment advisor made some unfortunate decisions with our portfolio." The mention of their house brought back memories, mostly of feeling like an outsider in what should have been my home. The bedroom decorated in Madeline's favorite colors while mine remained Spartan. Despite my request for painting supplies, the renovated sunroom that became Madeline's dance practice space while I did homework at the kitchen table. The family photographs lining the hallway, dominated by Madeline's smiling face, with only a handful, including me. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "Have you spoken with a financial advisor about restructuring?" "Actually, we were hoping." She paused. "We know you've done well for yourself, Olivia. Your father and I were wondering if you might consider helping us with a loan, just until we can get things sorted out." The request shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. In all the years I'd struggled, working through college when my education fund mysteriously disappeared to cover family expenses, later revealed to be Madeline's extravagant wedding, living in a studio apartment with 3 roommates, taking on freelance work on weekends to make ends meet, they had never once offered financial assistance. "How much are you talking about?" I asked, my voice neutral. Another pause. "We were thinking about $175,000. I nearly dropped the phone. "That's a significant amount." "We know, dear. But you're doing so well now, and family helps family. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't absolutely necessary." Family helps family. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I'd needed help with tuition, the answer had been clear: figure it out yourself. When I'd needed a place to stay for 3 months between apartments during my first job, they'd suggested I find a friend's couch, rather than use Madeline's perfectly empty bedroom since she'd moved out after her wedding. "What about Madeline?" I asked. "Can she contribute?" My mother's tone changed immediately. "You know they're still establishing themselves. With the children and the new house, they're stretched thin as it is." Establishing themselves. My sister and her husband both worked at my father's former bank, positions secured through his connections. They owned a 4-bedroom house in an exclusive neighborhood and took annual vacations to Europe. Yet somehow, they were always described as just getting started or finding their footing. "I'll need to think about it," I said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make immediately." "Of course," my mother replied, disappointment evident in her voice. "But we do need to know relatively soon. The property taxes are due next month, and your father has follow-up appointments scheduled." After ending the call, I sat motionless. In my office, the skyline of Boston twinkling beyond my window as evening descended. The presentation I'd been so focused on minutes ago now seemed distant and unimportant compared to the emotional weight of my mother's request. My phone chimed again, an email this time, from my father with an attachment detailing their financial situation and wiring instructions for the requested funds. The subject line read simply, "Family Matter." Ryan texted asking if I was on SA. My way. I gathered my things and headed to the elevator, my mind racing with conflicting emotions, anger at the years of favoritism and dismissal, guilt at the thought of refusing help to aging parents, resentment that they turned to me only when they needed something, and beneath it all, a small, persistent desire for the approval I'd never fully received. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool April air clearing my head slightly, I realized this request represented more than money. It was a turning point, a moment that would define my relationship with my parents moving forward. Would I continue the pattern of accommodating their expectations while diminishing my own needs? Or would this be the moment I established boundaries that honored the life I'd worked so hard to build? The restaurant was only 3 blocks away, but I walked slowly, knowing that Ryan would notice my distraction immediately. He had an architect's eye for detail, especially when it came to my emotional state. I thought about the home my parents might lose, the place that had never truly felt like mine despite the years I'd lived there. I thought about Madeline, who would undoubtedly be spared any request for financial assistance, despite her comfortable circumstances. I thought about my hard-earned savings, designated for a down payment on the converted warehouse space Ryan and I had our eyes on. And beneath all these thoughts ran a deeper question. Did I owe my parents my resources simply because we shared DNA? Or did the years of emotional neglect and financial abandonment release me from that obligation? By the time I reached the restaurant, I had made no decisions. But I knew the coming days would force a reckoning, not just with my parents, but with my own values and priorities. Whatever choice I made would reshape my family dynamics permanently. As Ryan waved from our favorite corner table, I took a deep breath, preparing to share the situation with the person who had become more family to me than my actual relatives. The irony wasn't lost on me, seeking counsel about family obligation. From someone who had no biological connection to me, but had shown more consistent care than those who did. This was just the beginning of what promised to be a complicated journey through family expectations, personal boundaries, and the true meaning of obligation. One thing was certain: I would no longer be the afterthought in my own life story. The dinner with Ryan should have been celebratory. We had secured the Henderson Project, a sustainable urban development that would put Helios architecture on the map nationally, and tonight was meant to toast our success. Instead, I found myself picking at my grilled salmon while explaining my parents' unexpected financial request. $175,000? Ryan set down his fork, eyebrows raised. That's almost your entire down payment fund. I nodded, taking a sip of wine to ease the tightness in my throat. They sent details of their situation. Dad's medical bills are significant. 3 cardiac procedures in the last year alone. And apparently, they invested heavily in a friend's business venture that collapsed. Ryan listened attentively as I outlined what I knew. Always analytical, he asked practical questions about their assets, insurance coverage, and whether they'd explored other options. But eventually he addressed the emotional element I was dancing around. "Liv, I know this isn't just about money," he said gently. "This is about everything that came before." The understanding in his eyes nearly undid me. Ryan knew my history. The canceled dance lessons when both girls' activities became too expensive, though Madeline's continued. The community college start while Madeline went straight to a private university. The Christmas when my parents gifted Madeline a car while I received a department store gift card. I built my life without their help, I said finally. When I needed them, they made it clear I was on my own, and now they're treating me like their financial safety net. Have you spoken with Madeline about this? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I shook my head. Not yet, but I can predict exactly how that conversation will go. She'll say they'd never ask if they weren't desperate, that I should be grateful I'm in a position to help, and that I'm being selfish if I hesitate. After dinner, we walked along the harbor, the city lights reflecting on the dark water. The spring air carried a slight chill, and Ryan wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "Whatever you decide, I support you," he said. "Just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, not from guilt or hope for approval or obligation." Back at my apartment, I opened my laptop and reviewed the financial documents my father had sent. Their situation was worse than my mother had indicated. Beyond the medical bills and failed investment, they had accumulated significant credit card debt maintaining appearances, designer furniture, country club dues, annual trips to visit Madeline's family in their vacation destinations. I navigated to my own financial dashboard. My savings had been meticulously built over years of living below my means. The warehouse, conversion Ryan and I had been eyeing, would be our first home together, a commitment to our future that had taken years to prepare for. Could I really give up that dream to bail out parents who had consistently prioritized my sister over me? As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang with Madeline's ringtone. "You are my sunshine," our mother's nickname for her since childhood. "Olivia," she began without preamble, "Mom said she spoke with you about their situation." "Hello to you too, Madeline," I replied, already feeling the familiar tension between us. "Yes, she called earlier today. So you'll help them, right? They wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." Just as I had predicted. No question of whether I could afford it or what it might mean for my own plans. No mention of her contributing, just the assumption that I would comply. "I'm considering my options," I said carefully. "It's a significant amount of money." Her sigh crackled through the phone. "It's just money, Olivia. They're our parents." "Are you contributing anything?" I asked directly. A pause. You know our situation is different. We have the boys' private school tuition, and we just put in the pool. Plus, we're hosting Mom and Dad at the lake house this summer. That's our contribution. The inequity was so familiar it almost made me laugh. Madeline's financial commitments were always presented as immovable obligations, while mine were flexible resources available for family appropriation. I see, I said neutrally. And have they explored other options? Reverse mortgage, selling assets, downsizing? They shouldn't have to leave their home at their age, Madeline said, her voice sharp. Honestly, Olivia, I don't understand why you're being difficult about this. You don't have children to support. You live in that tiny apartment. Your expenses are minimal compared to ours. My tiny apartment was a carefully restored 1920s building in one of Boston's most desirable neighborhoods, a deliberate choice that allowed me to walk to work and enjoy the city I loved. But through Madeline's lens, any lifestyle that didn't mirror her suburban existence was somehow lesser. I'll make my decision after I've spoken directly with Dad, I said, unwilling to engage in the same old argument. I need to understand exactly what happened and what plans they have beyond this immediate crisis. Fine, she huffed. But don't take too long. They're stressed enough as it is. After hanging up, I sent a text to my father requesting a video call the following evening. His response came quickly, too quickly for someone who typically took days to answer my messages. 7:30 works. Your mother will be at her book club. We can speak privately. The next day passed in a blur of meetings and project deadlines. At lunch, I called my bank to discuss the implications of withdrawing such a large sum from my savings. The personal banker's concerned expression spoke volumes even through the video interface. Ms. Bennett, that withdrawal would significantly impact your mortgage pre-approval status, she explained. The funds you've designated for your down payment are a key component of your application's strength. Another piece of my carefully constructed future potentially sacrificed to family obligation. By the time 7:30 arrived, I had prepared a list of specific questions and possible alternatives to simply handing over my savings. I connected to the video call from my home office, a space I had meticulously designed to reflect my professional identity. Clean lines, architectural prints, and the award I'd received last year for innovative urban redesign prominently displayed. My father's face appeared on screen, looking older than I remembered from Christmas 6 months ago. The confident bank manager who had intimidated me throughout childhood now seemed diminished, his complexion ashen beneath his silver hair. Olivia, he said, his voice still carrying that formal tone he'd always used with me, so different from the warmth he showed Madeline. Thank you for making time to speak with me. Of course, Dad. I wanted to understand your situation more clearly. He nodded, shoulders squared despite his obvious discomfort. I presume you've reviewed the documents I sent? I have. But they don't explain how this happened. You always emphasized financial prudence, at least to me. The last word slipped out before I could stop them. If he caught the implication, he didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he launched into an explanation of market downturns, unexpected medical costs, and a business investment with his former colleague that had seemed promising. His voice took on the didactic tone I remembered from childhood, explaining complex concepts as if I couldn't possibly understand them without his simplification. What I don't see, I interrupted, is why this requires my intervention specifically. The documents show you have other options. Downsizing, liquidating investments, even with penalties. His expression tightened. Those options would require significant lifestyle adjustments for your mother and me. Whereas taking my down payment funds requires significant adjustment only for me, I observed. Silence stretched between us, the unspoken reality of our relationship suddenly visible. In his worldview, my sacrifices were expected while his were unreasonable. Olivia, he finally said, his tone now conciliatory. You've always been the independent one. So capable, so self-sufficient. Madeline needs more support. She always has. It's just her nature. There it was, the familiar narrative that had shaped my entire existence within our family. My independence wasn't a quality developed through necessity. In their minds, it was an innate characteristic that justified their neglect. Did it ever occur to you, I asked quietly, that I became self-sufficient because I had no other choice? My father looked genuinely startled by the question. Something flickered across his face, discomfort, perhaps even the dawning of recognition. But habits of thought formed over decades don't dissolve in a moment of insight. We've always been proud of your accomplishments, he said, sidestepping my question. And we wouldn't ask for help if the situation weren't dire. I took a deep breath, centering myself. I understand that, Dad, but I need to know something before I make any decisions. If the situation were reversed, if I were the one facing financial hardship, what would you do? He blinked, clearly unprepared for this hypothetical. That's not a fair question, Olivia. You're not in financial hardship. You've made prudent choices. But if I were, I pressed, would you liquidate assets to help me? Would you ask Madeline to contribute her savings? His hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I thought so, I said softly. I'll need time to consider what I'm able to do. In the meantime, I've researched some options you might not have explored. I shared my screen, showing him information about reverse mortgages designed for seniors with substantial home equity and healthcare cost management programs. By the end of our conversation, nothing had been decided, but something had shifted. For perhaps the first time, I had engaged with my father as an equal, not a daughter seeking approval, but an adult with her own valid perspective and boundaries. As I closed my laptop, I realized that whatever financial decision I ultimately made, a more important choice had already been made. I would no longer measure my worth by my parents' assessment. Their narrative about who I was and what I deserved had shaped my childhood, but it would not determine my future. The question remained, could I separate my resentment of past treatment from their genuine need in the present? And was it possible to help without reverting to old patterns of self-sacrifice and invisibility? As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with a text from Ryan. No matter what you decide, remember that your value isn't measured by what you give or withhold. You deserve your dreams too. His words settled something in me. Whatever I decided. About the money, this situation had already given me something valuable, the opportunity to redefine my relationship with my family on my own terms. The morning after my conversation with my father, I woke before my alarm, my mind already cycling through scenarios. I needed perspective beyond my own conflicted emotions, and Ryan's supportive but understandably biased viewpoint. I called Lauren Davies, my mentor from graduate school who had navigated her own complicated family dynamics while building a successful architectural practice. Now in her 60s, Lauren had become the voice of wisdom I turned to when facing professional and personal crossroads. We met for coffee at her favorite bakery in Cambridge, the morning sun streaming through the windows as she listened attentively to my situation. Your parents have activated every emotional trigger they installed during your childhood, she observed after I finished explaining. The expectation of sacrifice, the contrast with your sister's treatment, the dismissal of your financial needs as less significant than theirs. But Olivia, there's something I need you to see clearly. She leaned forward, her experienced eyes holding mine steadily. This isn't just about $175,000. This is about establishing the foundation for the next phase of your relationship with your parents. If you simply hand over your savings without addressing the underlying patterns, you're signing up for a lifetime of similar expectations and extractions. Her words crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. This request wasn't an isolated incident. It was the natural progression of a dynamic established decades ago. So what do I do? Refuse entirely? The thought brought both relief and anxiety. Lauren shook her head. I'm not telling you what decision to make about the money. I'm suggesting you recognize this as an opportunity to establish new terms of engagement. Whatever financial help you provide, if any, should come with clear boundaries and explicit recognition of what it means for your own future. As I walked back to my office, Lauren's perspective helped me see beyond the immediate crisis to the longer-term implications. My parents weren't just asking for financial assistance. They were expecting me to slide back into my assigned family role, the self-sufficient daughter whose needs always came second. At my desk, I opened a new document and began a systematic analysis of options. Professional training had taught me to approach complex problems by breaking them down into manageable components. I created 3 columns: provide full amount, provide partial support, and decline financial assistance. Under each, I listed practical implications, emotional consequences, and potential long-term outcomes. The exercise brought clarity. Neither extreme, giving everything or nothing, felt aligned with who I wanted to be. But a middle path would require something more difficult than writing a check or sending a refusal. It would demand honest conversation about decades of family dynamics. My concentration was interrupted by another call from my mother. Olivia, have you made a decision? The property tax notice arrived yesterday with a late penalty assessment. The urgency in her voice triggered my habitual response, the impulse to solve problems and ease tension, even at my own expense. But Lauren's words echoed in my mind. Mom, I've been considering the situation carefully, I replied. Before I make any financial commitments, we need to have a family meeting. You, Dad, Madeline, and me. All of us together discussing options and contributions. The silence on Dao Yai, the other end, spoke volumes. A family meeting isn't necessary, she finally said. This is a private matter between your father and me. We only involved you because of the immediate need. If it's significant enough to request nearly my entire savings, it's significant enough to discuss as a family, I countered. I'm available this weekend, either in person or by video conference. After more resistance, she reluctantly agreed to Saturday afternoon. I immediately texted Madeline, who responded with predictable frustration about rearranging her children's activities to accommodate the meeting. Nonetheless, she committed to joining virtually. The intervening days brought mounting pressure. My father sent updated financial statements highlighting their deteriorating position. Madeline called twice to emphasize our parents' stress levels and suggest I was being needlessly difficult. Even my aunt, my mother's sister, reached out, unusual enough that it clearly signaled coordinated family effort. Your parents have always been there for you girls, she said, conveniently forgetting the college fund incident and countless other examples to the contrary. By Saturday morning, I felt the magnetic pull of old patterns. The path of least resistance would be to simply transfer the funds, earn momentary approval, and postpone confrontation. But sitting across from Ryan at breakfast, watching him sketch potential layouts for the warehouse space we hoped to call home, I found my resolve strengthening. What if they react badly? I asked him. What if this damages my relationship with them permanently? Ryan set down his pencil. Liv, what relationship are you actually protecting? One where you're valued for what you can provide, or one where you're respected as an equal? Sometimes relationships need to break their old form before they can be rebuilt into something healthier. At precisely 2:00 p.m., I initiated the video conference from my dining table. My parents appeared together on one screen, seated in the formal living room that had always been off limits for everyday use during my childhood. Madeline joined from her car, apparently parked outside her son's soccer practice. Thank you all for making time for this conversation, I began, consciously using the professional tone I'd developed for client meetings. I've given considerable thought to Mom and Dad's financial situation and request. Before you continue, my father interrupted. Your mother and I have been discussing alternatives. We're prepared to offer you an equity position in the house in exchange for your assistance. The statement, framed as a generous concession, revealed how little they understood my perspective. They weren't offering partnership. They were attempting to repackage their request as an investment opportunity. That's not what this meeting is about, I said firmly. This isn't a negotiation over terms. It's a necessary conversation about family patterns that have gone unaddressed for too long. My mother's expression tightened. Olivia, if you're planning to dredge up childhood grievances, they aren't grievances, Mom. They're relevant context for why this situation feels so problematic to me. I took a steadying breath. For as long as I can remember, there have been two standards in our family, one for Madeline and one for me. Support, attention, financial assistance, all have been distributed unequally. Madeline immediately objected. That's not fair, Olivia. You're making our parents' emergency about your personal issues. This is precisely my point, I replied. When I needed financial help for college after my dedicated fund disappeared, it was my personal issue to solve. When you needed help with the down payment for your first house, it was a family priority that required their assistance. My father shifted uncomfortably. Different circumstances require different responses. Exactly my point, I agreed. And my current circumstances require me to protect my financial future. The funds you're requesting represent years of careful saving for a home purchase that's currently in progress. The silence that followed was telling. It had genuinely never occurred to them that my financial goals might be as important as their needs or Madeline's priorities. What are you saying? My mother finally asked. That you won't help at all? I'm saying I won't sacrifice my entire financial security without addressing the patterns that brought us here. I opened the document I had prepared. I've researched several options that would address your situation without requiring liquidation of my savings. For the next 30 minutes, I outlined alternatives, a reverse mortgage that would allow them to access their substantial home equity, downsizing to a property that better suited their current needs, restructuring investment withdrawals to optimize tax efficiency, and a payment plan for medical bills that would reduce immediate pressure. Additionally, I continued, I'm prepared to contribute $40,000 to address the most urgent obligations. This represents what I can provide without jeopardizing my own housing plans. My father's expression was difficult to read, somewhere between surprise and reluctant respect. Madeline, however, was clearly displeased. That's not even a quarter of what they need, she objected. What are you contributing, Madeline? I asked directly. She flushed. You know our situation is different. Yes, it is, I acknowledged. You've already received significant family financial support that was never extended to me. Now it's time for proportional contribution. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable, revealing financial assumptions and entitlements that had never been explicitly stated, but had shaped our family dynamics for decades. My parents had simply never questioned their resource allocation, decisions, or considered how they might appear from my perspective. I had no idea you still felt this way about your college funding, my mother said, genuine confusion in her voice. We assumed you understood that circumstances were tight then. Yet they weren't too tight to cover Madeline's wedding the following year, I pointed out. These weren't just financial decisions, Mom. They were statements about priorities and values. By the meeting's end, nothing was fully resolved, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, I had refused to accept the family narrative that my needs were somehow less legitimate than my sister's or my parents'. We'll need to discuss the options you've presented, my father said finally, his tone more respectful than I could remember him using with me. And we appreciate the offer of partial assistance though it's less than we hoped for. After the call ended, I sat quietly at my dining table, emotionally drained but strangely peaceful. I had expected to feel guilty or anxious after setting boundaries, but instead felt a growing sense of alignment, as if disparate parts of myself were finally working in harmony rather than conflict. My phone buzzed with a text from Madeline. "We need to talk privately." I replied simply, "I'm available tomorrow afternoon." Whatever came next would undoubtedly be challenging. Patterns established over decades don't change through a single conversation. But I had taken the crucial first step, acknowledging the reality of our family dynamic and refusing to perpetuate it through my own compliance. As evening fell, I walked to the warehouse building Ryan and I hoped to call home. Standing across the street, I studied its solid brick structure, large windows, and the potential it held for our future. This wasn't just a real estate purchase. It was a physical manifestation of the life I had worked to create, one built on my own terms, reflecting my own values. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly believe that this future deserved protection and priority, not because my family's needs weren't important, but because mine were equally so. Madeline called precisely at 2 o'clock the next day. I had spent the morning with Ryan exploring the warehouse space again, measuring rooms and discussing renovation possibilities with the current owner. The activity had grounded me, reinforcing what was at stake personally while providing perspective on the family situation. "I still can't believe you did that," Madeline began without preamble. Her voice carried the familiar tone of disbelief she'd used since childhood, whenever I failed to conform to family expectations. "Mom barely slept last night. Dad's blood pressure is probably through the roof." I settled into my office chair, gazing out at the Boston skyline. "Hello to you too, Madeline. I'm doing well. Thanks for asking." "This isn't the time for sarcasm, Olivia. This is serious." "Yes, it is serious," I agreed. "Which is why I suggested a family meeting to discuss real solutions rather than just transferring my savings." I heard her exhale sharply. "Look, I get that you have some unresolved issues about growing up." "This isn't about unresolved childhood issues," I interrupted, refusing to let her diminish the legitimate concerns I'd raised. "This is about addressing our parents' current financial situation in a way that's sustainable and equitable. The options I presented yesterday are practical, not emotional." "But they need immediate help," she insisted. "The reverse mortgage process takes time. Downsizing means selling their home, which could take months." "That's why I offered $40,000 for immediate expenses," I reminded her. "But long-term solutions require structural changes, not just emergency cash infusions." The line went quiet for a moment. When Madeline spoke again, her voice had shifted to the conciliatory tone she used when trying to manage difficult situations, usually by asking someone else to compromise. "What if we came up with a plan together? I know I can't match your financial contribution, but maybe there's another way I could help." This was new territory. Throughout our lives, Madeline had never acknowledged any imbalance in family support or resources. Her offer, however tentative, represented potential progress. "I'm listening," I said. "Mom and Dad could stay with us for a while after they sell the house," she suggested. "That would give them time to find something suitable without rushing. And maybe I could handle the logistics of downsizing, organizing the move, the estate sale, all of that." It was a reasonable proposal, the first time Madeline had offered any substantive assistance beyond emotional support. But experience had taught me to clarify expectations before committing. "That could work," I acknowledged. "But we'd need clear timelines and boundaries. How long would they stay with you? What financial contribution toward household expenses would they make? And what price range would they be looking at for their new home?" Madeline hesitated. "I hadn't thought about all those details yet. The boys would need to give up the guest room, but we could make it work temporarily. As for their new home budget..." I guess that depends partly on how much they can get for the current house. And how much financial assistance they expect from me, I added. Well, yes, she admitted. They were counting on your help for the new place, too. And there it was. The assumption that my financial support would continue indefinitely, beyond the immediate crisis. The $175,000 was just the beginning. Madeline, I need to be very clear about something, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. I'm willing to provide limited help for urgent needs, but I won't be their ongoing financial safety net. Any long-term plan needs to be sustainable based on their own resources. The conversation that followed was difficult, but surprisingly productive. For perhaps the first time in our adult lives, Madeline and I engaged as collaborators rather than competitors. We mapped out a potential plan. I would provide the $40,000 for immediate obligations. Our parents would initiate the process of selling their house. They would stay with Madeline for a maximum of 3 months, and they would purchase a new property based exclusively on what they could afford from their home sale proceeds. I'll present this to them, Madeline said finally. It's less than they hoped for, but it's a workable solution. Thank you, I said, genuinely appreciative of her willingness to share some of the family responsibility. This feels like a step in the right direction. After hanging up, I allowed myself a moment of cautious optimism. Perhaps this crisis could lead to healthier family dynamics, ones based on mutual respect rather than established roles and expectations. The following week passed without incident. I transferred the $40,000 as promised, receiving brief thanks from my father via email. Madeline reported that our parents had met with a real estate agent to discuss listing their house. The established plan seemed to be proceeding. Then came the unexpected invitation. My parents wanted me to join them for dinner on Friday evening, to express their gratitude properly. Madeline and her family would be there as well. Ryan raised an eyebrow when I mentioned it. Family dinner at their house? That's unusual. He was right. Throughout my adult life, family gatherings had occurred almost exclusively at Madeline's home or restaurants for major occasions. I had visited my parents' house perhaps 3 times in the past 5 years. Maybe this is their way of acknowledging the new dynamic, I suggested. A gesture of appreciation. Ryan looked skeptical, but supportive. Just maintain your boundaries. Family patterns have a way of reasserting themselves in familiar environments. Friday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, trees along Commonwealth Avenue already showing early blossoms. I parked in front of my parents' colonial, noting the fresh mulch in the flower beds and newly painted shutters. Clearly, they were preparing the property for sale, which felt like positive confirmation of our agreement. My mother greeted me at the door with unusual warmth, embracing me briefly before ushering me inside. Olivia, you look wonderful. That color is perfect on you. The compliment, though minor, was noticeable in its rarity. Throughout the house, I spotted subtle changes, spaces cleared of clutter, furniture rearranged to highlight architectural features, family photographs curated to showcase the home's history. The place looks great, I commented as she led me to the dining room. The real estate agent suggested these changes? Yes, she's been marvelous, my mother confirmed. Very knowledgeable about current market preferences. In the dining room, my father was pouring wine while Madeline's husband Tom entertained their sons. Madeline emerged from the kitchen carrying a serving dish, her expression brightening when she saw me. Olivia, perfect timing. We're just about to sit down. The family dinner that followed was surreal in its pleasantness. My parents inquired about my current projects at work, listened attentively to my responses, and even asked about Ryan with what seemed like genuine interest. Madeline spoke enthusiastically about the temporary bedroom they were preparing for our parents at their home. It wasn't until dessert, my mother's signature apple tart, that the conversation shifted to financial matters. We've been overwhelmed by your generosity, Olivia, my father began. raising his glass slightly. Your contribution allowed us to address the most pressing obligations. I'm glad it helped, I said simply. The house should list next week, my mother added. Our agent believes it will move quickly in this market. That's excellent news, I replied. Have you started looking at potential new properties? A glance passed between my parents that immediately triggered my internal warning system, the subtle communication developed through decades of marriage that preceded important announcements. Actually, my father continued, setting down his wine glass deliberately, we've been discussing alternatives with Madeline and Tom. I looked at my sister, who suddenly seemed very interested in rearranging her dessert fork. What kind of alternatives? I asked cautiously. Well, my mother interjected, her voice taking on the bright tone she used when presenting an idea she was particularly invested in. We've realized that selling might not be the best option after all. This house has been our home for 30 years. All our memories are here. I set down my own fork, processing this pivot. I thought we had agreed that downsizing was necessary to address the financial situation long term. That was before we fully explored all options, my father explained. Madeline and Tom have suggested an arrangement that would allow us to stay. I turned to my sister, whose expression confirmed my suspicion that this new plan had been developed without my knowledge. What arrangement is that? Tom cleared his throat. We've been considering investment properties for some time. Your parents' home has excellent bones and is in a desirable neighborhood. We could purchase it at a fair market value, which would give them the capital they need, and then lease it back to them at a reduced rate. I see, I said slowly, the implications becoming clear. And how would they afford even reduced rent, given their current fixed income? Another meaningful glance between my parents. That's where we hoped you might consider restructuring your assistance, my father said. Instead of a one-time contribution, perhaps a monthly supplement to help with their housing costs. It would actually be less overall than what you originally discussed. The elegance of the manipulation was almost admirable. They had accepted my initial help, used it to address immediate pressure, and now were attempting to redirect the conversation toward ongoing support rather than structural change. Meanwhile, Madeline and Tom would acquire a valuable property at what would surely be a favorable price, given the circumstances. I looked around the table at their expectant faces and felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding or miscommunication. This was a coordinated effort to maintain the status quo while appearing to adapt. Let me make sure I understand, I said carefully. Instead of selling the house and purchasing something within their means, you're proposing that Mom and Dad sell to you and Tom at fair market value, which you'll determine. And then I provide ongoing monthly support so they can continue living beyond their means? Madeline flushed. That's not a fair characterization, Olivia. We're trying to find a solution that addresses their financial needs while preserving their quality of life, while also securing an investment property for yourselves at a convenient moment, I added. We would be taking on significant risk, Tom countered. Property taxes, maintenance costs, potential market fluctuations. I turned to my parents. And what happens when I want to purchase my own home? Will my monthly contributions to your housing still be expected then? My mother's expression shifted to one I recognized from childhood. Disappointment tinged with martyrdom. We had hoped you would see this as a way to honor family commitments while allowing us some dignity in our later years. The familiar guilt tactics washed over me, but found no purchase. In their minds, my sister's financial interests were aligned with family values, while my desire to secure my own future was selfish individualism. I made a clear one-time contribution with the understanding that sustainable changes would follow, I said firmly. That remains my position. I won't be providing ongoing monthly support for an unsustainable living situation. My father's jaw tightened. So, you're withdrawing your commitment to help? No, I corrected him. I'm maintaining the commitment we actually discussed and agreed upon, not the new arrangement you've developed without consulting me. The pleasant family dinner atmosphere evaporated completely. Madeline began clearing plates with unnecessary force while Tom suddenly remembered urgent emails requiring his attention. My parents exchanged looks of shared disappointment in their difficult younger daughter. As I drove home that evening, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: frustration at the attempted manipulation, sadness at the predictable return to established patterns, but also a strengthening sense of my own clarity and resolve. I had maintained my boundaries despite considerable pressure, honoring my own priorities while still offering reasonable support. The attempted redirection had failed, but I harbored no illusions that this would be the last effort to draw me back into familiar dynamics. Family patterns established over decades don't dissolve after a few conversations, no matter how direct or honest. What had changed, however, was my participation in those patterns. For perhaps the first time, I had entered a family situation with clear boundaries and maintained them despite emotional pressure. The path forward remained uncertain, but my orientation to it had fundamentally shifted. 3 days after the family dinner, my email notification chimed with a message from my father. The subject line read simply, "Formal notice." The email contained a PDF attachment, a legal letter from my parents' newly retained attorney, formally withdrawing me from their will and trust documents. The accompanying message was brief and businesslike. Olivia, following recent discussions, your mother and I have decided to restructure our estate planning to reflect current family priorities and contributions. The attached document provides formal notification of these changes. We trust you will understand that difficult circumstances necessitate difficult decisions. Regards, Dad. I stared at the screen, a hollow feeling expanding in my chest. The implicit threat had become explicit: financial support in exchange for inheritance rights, with withdrawal of the latter serving as punishment for refusing the former. My phone rang almost immediately after I opened the email. It was Madeline, her voice tense. "Did you get Dad's email?" "Just now," I confirmed, surprised by my own calm. "I assume you received a different version?" "I didn't get any email," she said, confusion evident. Mom called to tell me what they'd done. Olivia, I had no idea they were planning this. I tried to talk them out of it, but they're adamant. Her apparent shock seemed genuine. Perhaps this was my parents' unilateral decision rather than a coordinated family strategy. Either way, the outcome remained the same. It's their estate, to distribute as they see fit, I said, my professional tone masking the complex emotions beneath. "But it's so extreme," Madeline protested. "Completely removing you after one disagreement?" I told them they were overreacting. I appreciated her objection, however belated. "Thank you for trying to advocate for me. But honestly, Madeline, this doesn't change anything substantive. Their estate will likely be minimal by the time they're gone anyway, given their financial management patterns." After hanging up, I forwarded the email to Ryan with a brief message: "Family priorities made explicit." His response came quickly, offering to cancel his evening meeting and come over, expressing outrage on my behalf, asking what support I needed. I declined his offer, needing space to process this development alone. What surprised me most was not my parents' action itself, but my reaction to it. The disinheritance was clearly intended to inflict emotional pain and leverage my return to compliance. Yet instead of devastation, I felt an unexpected sense of liberation. For years, the possibility of eventual inheritance had functioned as a subtle tether, influencing decisions in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. How many family gatherings had I attended primarily out of obligation? How often had I tempered my honest opinions to maintain peace? The amorphous future reward had shaped present choices, creating a form of emotional indebtedness my parents had now unintentionally canceled. Still, as evening fell and I worked late at my drafting table, the full emotional impact began to surface. Being formally excised from family inheritance, regardless of the potential monetary value, represented the ultimate confirmation of conditional belonging. My parents had made explicit what had been implied throughout my life. My value was measured by compliance with their expectations. Sleep eluded me that night. I found myself scrolling through old family photographs stored on my cloud drive. Holiday gatherings, graduation ceremonies, rare vacations. In virtually every image, the family configuration told its own story. My parents physically closer to Madeline, their expressions more animated when focused on her, my position often peripheral. The visual evidence of lifelong patterns hit harder than the disinheritance itself. This wasn't about money or property. It was about belonging and worth. My parents had consistently treated me as less deserving, less important, less theirs. And now they had formalized that assessment in legal documents. Morning brought no clarity, only exhaustion and a hollowed-out feeling that followed me to work. I moved through client meetings mechanically, my professional training allowing me to function despite emotional turbulence. During lunch, I received another email, this one from my mother, with uncharacteristic vulnerability in her tone. Olivia, perhaps your father's approach was excessively formal. We don't wish for permanent estrangement. Family relationships should transcend financial disagreements. We would welcome the opportunity to discuss compromise solutions that acknowledge both our needs and your concerns. The olive branch was extended, but the underlying message remained unchanged. Return to established patterns, and your place in the family will be restored. It wasn't reconciliation they sought, but compliance. After work, rather than going home, I found myself driving to the cemetery where my grandparents were buried. My father's parents had died before I was born, but my mother's parents had been present throughout my childhood. My grandmother, in particular, had been my ally, the one person who seemed to see and value me independently from family hierarchy. Standing before her headstone, I remembered her quiet encouragements, the way she had once defended my decision to study architecture when my parents suggested more practical alternatives. She had recognized my talents when others overlooked them, championed my independence when others sought to constrain it. "What would you advise now, Grandma?" I whispered, the spring wind catching my words. "How do you honor family while protecting yourself?" No answer came from the granite marker, but memories surfaced. My grandmother describing her own struggles with family expectations, her deliberate choices to define her own path despite pressure to conform. She had modeled quiet strength long before I recognized its value. On the drive home, I reached a decision. I pulled into a coffee shop parking lot and composed a response to my parents. "I've received your notifications regarding the estate. Changes. That is, of course, entirely your decision to make. My offer of assistance remains as originally stated, the $40,000 already provided for immediate needs, plus guidance on sustainable financial restructuring. This offer stands independent of inheritance considerations or ongoing financial commitments beyond my means. I value family relationships built on mutual respect and understanding. I remain open to conversations that acknowledge both our perspectives as equally valid, rather than positioning mine as subordinate to established patterns. With love and clarity, Olivia." After sending the email, I called Ryan and asked if his dinner offer still stood. An hour later, we sat across from each other at our favorite neighborhood bistro, my emotional exhaustion finally giving way to tearful release as I recounted the day's developments. "Maybe I should just give them what they want," I said after. The immediate emotional wave subsided. Transfer the full amount, secure my place in the family, stop fighting patterns too entrenched to change. Ryan reached across the table, taking my hand. "You could do that. But what message would it send to yourself? That your boundaries are negotiable, your future less valuable than temporary approval?" his question crystallized the fundamental choice before me: continued participation in damaging family dynamics for the sake of belonging, or authentic self-advocacy at the risk of rejection. There's something else to consider, Ryan added gently. What happens after you give them the full amount? Do you think that would truly resolve the underlying patterns, or would it simply reinforce them, leading to future expectations and extractions? The question hung between us as our meals arrived. I pushed pasta around my plate, appetite diminished by emotional exhaustion. You know what hurts most? I finally said. It's not the disinheritance itself. It's the confirmation that my place in the family has always been conditional, subject to compliance with unequal expectations. Ryan nodded, understanding evident in his expression. But Olivia, recognizing that truth, painful as it is, also offers freedom. If their acceptance is truly conditional, then maybe it's not something worth continually sacrificing for. Later that night, lying awake beside Ryan's sleeping form, I faced the darkest question of all. What if maintaining my boundaries meant permanent estrangement from my family? Could I accept that outcome as the price of self-respect and authentic living? The prospect brought profound sadness, not for the loss of current dysfunctional dynamics, but for the family relationship that might have been possible under different circumstances. I mourned the parents who might have valued me equally, the sister who might have been an ally rather than a competitor, the family support that might have flowed both ways rather than predominantly toward Madeline. Yet beneath this grief, I discovered a surprising resilience, a core self that had survived and even flourished despite unequal nurturing. I had built a successful career, meaningful relationships, and a value system that honored mutual respect and fairness. These achievements weren't despite my family experience, but partially because of it. The challenges had forced me to develop independence, discernment, and inner strength. As dawn light filtered through the bedroom curtains, I reached a moment of clarity. I could honor my family connections without sacrificing my hard-won boundaries. I could acknowledge my parents' genuine needs while refusing to enable harmful patterns. I could love them without surrendering to their definition of my worth. This wasn't capitulation or rebellion, it was integration. The path forward would be neither simple compliance nor complete rejection, but thoughtful engagement based on adult values rather than childhood conditioning. With this realization came not happiness exactly, but something more sustainable, a sense of congruence between external choices and internal truth. Whatever happened with my parents' financial situation or our ongoing relationship, I had found alignment with my own values. That foundation would support me through whatever challenges lay ahead. A week passed with no further communication from my family. The silence itself spoke volumes. My refusal to capitulate had disrupted the established script, leaving all parties unsure how to proceed without the familiar dynamics of pressure and acquiescence. I immersed myself in work, finding solace in the creative challenges of a new sustainable housing project that had particular personal resonance. On Wednesday afternoon, Lauren Davies called. "Have lunch with me tomorrow? I'm presenting at a symposium near your office and have a 2-hour break midday." The timing felt serendipitous. Lauren had always possessed an almost uncanny ability to appear at pivotal moments in my professional and personal journey. We met at a quiet restaurant overlooking the Charles River, the April sunshine finally bringing warmth after months of New England chill. Lauren looked elegant as always, her silver hair swept into a simple knot, her architect's eye evident in the clean lines of her attire. "You look exhausted," she observed after we'd ordered. No preamble, no social niceties. Directness had always been her hallmark. I smiled despite myself. "That obvious? To someone who's known you for 12 years? Yes." She took a sip of water. "I'm guessing family matters haven't improved." Over our meal, I detailed the recent developments, the family dinner ambush, the disinheritance notice, my mother's subsequent outreach for compromise. Lauren listened with the focused attention she typically reserved for complex structural problems, asking occasional clarifying questions. "What interests me most," she said when I finished, "is your response to the disinheritance. Most people would react primarily with hurt or anger. You described something different, a sense of liberation beneath the pain." Her observation was characteristically perceptive. It clarified things, I acknowledged, made explicit what had been implicit throughout my life. Lauren nodded. "Olivia, do you know why I reached out to you specifically after that guest lecture I gave at MIT? Why I offered you mentorship when dozens of talented students approached me that day?" The question surprised me. Lauren had never explained why she'd taken particular interest in me 12 years ago, a connection that had profoundly shaped my professional trajectory. "I assumed you saw potential in my design concepts," I said. "My studio professor had highlighted my sustainable housing project." "Your work was promising," she agreed. "But what caught my attention was something different. During the Q&A, a senior faculty member rather dismissively challenged one of your questions. Do you remember?" I did, vaguely. A renowned professor suggesting my query about adaptive reuse economics reflected naive idealism rather than practical understanding. "You didn't become defensive or withdraw," Lauren continued. "Instead, you restated your question, with greater precision, clarifying the economic principles underlying your inquiry. You stood your ground without becoming combative, maintaining intellectual integrity despite the power imbalance." She leaned forward slightly. "That response told me more about your potential than any design portfolio could have." I sat with this revelation, seeing the parallel she was drawing to my current situation. "You're suggesting my family dynamic prepared me for professional challenges." "I'm suggesting that the same strength that helped you navigate academic environments where your viewpoint was undervalued serves you now in personal relationships with similar patterns." Lauren's expression softened slightly. "The question is how to harness that strength without becoming defined by opposition or resistance." Her words crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. The danger of building an identity primarily in contrast to my family's expectations, rather than from authentic self-definition. "How do I find that balance?" I asked. "By recognizing that your worth was never actually determined by their assessment," she replied simply. "Your parents' perspective is just that, their perspective, shaped by their own limitations and biases. It contains no more inherent truth about your value than that professor's dismissal reflected your academic capabilities." She gestured toward the river outside our window. "Water doesn't argue with obstacles in its path. It simply finds the natural way forward, sometimes flowing around, sometimes gradually transforming what blocks it. Your strength isn't in fighting old patterns, but in creating new channels that make those patterns irrelevant." "That sounds philosophically sound," I said with a small smile. "But practically speaking, I still have parents expecting financial support and using inheritance as leverage." Lauren nodded. "The practical question isn't whether you give or withhold money. It's whether your actions align with your core values regardless of external approval or rejection." She reached into her bag and retrieved a small notebook, flipping to a particular page. "Years ago, during my own family financial crisis, my therapist had me write down my core principles about money and relationships. Not what I thought I should believe, but what actually resonated at the deepest level." She slid the notebook toward me. In her precise handwriting, I read, 1. Financial support freely given honors both giver and receiver. Support extracted through obligation or manipulation diminishes both. 2. Genuine love creates space for individual growth and autonomy rather than demanding sacrifice of self for approval. 3. Family connection is valuable, but not at the cost of personal integrity or well-being. 4. My resources, financial, emotional, creative, are mine to allocate according to my values, not others' expectations. These became my touchstones, Lauren explained. When family situations triggered guilt or obligation, I returned to these principles, asking whether potential actions aligned with my authentic values or merely with conditioned responses. I studied the list, feeling its resonance. This provides clarity about how to approach decisions, but doesn't necessarily make the consequences easier to bear. True, Lauren acknowledged. Alignment with your values might cost you particular relationships, or, at minimum, transform them beyond recognition. The question is whether maintaining those relationships in their current form is worth the ongoing sacrifice of your authenticity. As our lunch concluded, Lauren shared a final perspective that would stay with me in the weeks ahead. Olivia, your parents and sister are experiencing the natural consequences of treating you as a resource rather than a full person with equal standing in the family. Their discomfort isn't something you've inflicted. It's the inevitable result of unsustainable relationship patterns finally encountering firm boundaries. Walking back to my office, I felt a shift in my perspective. Not a dramatic epiphany, but a subtle realignment, like adjusting the foundation of a structure to distribute weight more effectively. Lauren's mentorship had offered not specific advice about financial decisions, but something more valuable. A framework for making those decisions from a centered place of personal truth rather than reactive emotion. That evening, I created my own list of core principles, allowing them to emerge organically rather than forcing their articulation. 1. I give from abundance, not obligation, ensuring my own stability before extending resources to others. 2. I honor family connections while requiring mutual respect for my autonomy and choices. 3. I acknowledge others' needs without assuming disproportionate responsibility for meeting them. 4. I recognize that enabling unhealthy patterns serves no one's long-term well-being, regardless of short-term comfort. 5. I measure my worth by alignment with my values, not by others' approval or assessment. These principles wouldn't make difficult decisions effortless, but they provided solid ground from which to navigate the complex terrain ahead. The next morning brought an unexpected development. An email from my father with a drastically different tone from his previous communications. Olivia, your mother and I have consulted with a financial advisor who echoed many of the suggestions you initially provided. We've begun the process of listing the house and exploring suitable alternatives within our means. The attorney has been instructed to rescind the estate planning changes communicated earlier, a decision made in haste and frustration that we now regret. We would appreciate meeting with you, at your convenience, to discuss a path forward that respects both our circumstances and your boundaries. Regards, Dad. Reading between the lines, I suspected this reversal stemmed less from genuine insight than practical necessity. My parents had likely discovered that Madeline and Tom's property purchase proposal contained terms less favorable than initially presented, or perhaps their financial advisor had bluntly outlined the mathematical impossibility of maintaining their current lifestyle. Regardless of motivation, the shift created an opening for potential change. Rather than immediately accepting or rejecting their invitation, I took time to consider how to engage in a way aligned with my newly articulated principles. This wasn't about winning a power struggle, but establishing a healthier dynamic for whatever relationship might be possible moving forward. After consulting with Ryan, whose perspective I trusted implicitly, I responded, I'm open to meeting next weekend at the cafe near my office. I suggest Saturday at 10 a.m., which would allow us unrushed conversation. Please come prepared to discuss specific financial plans based on realistic assessments of your resources, rather than expectations of ongoing support beyond what I've already provided. I appreciate the reconsideration of estate matters, though. I want to be clear that my boundaries and decisions are not contingent on inheritance considerations. Regards, Olivia. The response maintained professional cordiality while establishing clear parameters for our interaction. Not hostile, but not automatically accommodating either. It represented what Lauren might call water finding its natural channel, neither confronting obstacles directly nor capitulating to their presence. That night, Ryan and I visited our potential future home again, walking through the empty warehouse space as sunset light streamed through the industrial windows. The building had strong bones, solid structure beneath cosmetic wear, much like the authentic self I was reclaiming beneath years of family conditioning. "What are you thinking?" Ryan asked as we stood in what would become our living area if our offer was accepted. "That it's possible to honor where you come from without being limited by it," I replied, watching dust motes dance in the golden light. "This building has a particular history, but its future isn't determined by its past purpose." He smiled, understanding the parallel I was drawing. Adaptive reuse at its finest, preserving what's valuable while creating something new. The caminos, architectural metaphor, felt particularly apt. My family relationships had shaped me, certainly, but didn't define my future trajectory. Like this industrial space with potential for transformation, I could acknowledge my origins while creating something entirely my own. As we locked up the building and headed home, I felt a growing certainty about the path ahead. Whatever transpired at Saturday's meeting with my parents, I would approach it from a place of centered clarity rather than reactive emotion or ingrained patterns. Lauren's mentorship had helped me recognize that true strength wasn't in fighting old dynamics, but in establishing new ones aligned with authentic values. The coming conversation would undoubtedly challenge this resolve, triggering well-worn emotional responses and habitual accommodations. But something fundamental had shifted in my orientation to family dynamics. Not a dramatic rupture, but a quiet, profound realignment that would shape all future interactions. For perhaps the first time, I was approaching my family not as the accommodating daughter seeking approval, but as a whole person with legitimate boundaries and equal standing. This transformation didn't guarantee external outcomes. My parents might reject this new dynamic entirely, but it ensured internal congruence regardless of their response. As Ryan and I discussed renovation possibilities for the warehouse, I realized I was planning our future with a newfound sense of permission, not seeking validation for my choices, but simply making them according to my own values and vision. This subtle but profound shift represented the most significant inheritance I could claim, not financial resources, but the authority to define my own life on my own terms. Saturday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, one of those perfect spring days that makes Boston feel like the most livable city in the world. I chose my outfit deliberately, professional but not formal, a balance between approachability and self-possession. The cafe I'd selected offered both privacy and neutrality, neither my territory nor theirs, but common ground where new patterns might emerge. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table that provided both discretion for our conversation and a clear view of the entrance. The waitstaff knew me well enough to keep coffee flowing without hovering, creating space for uninterrupted dialogue. My parents arrived precisely at 10, my father holding the door for my mother with the practiced courtesy of their 40-year marriage. They looked different somehow, not physically changed in the weeks since our last encounter, but carrying themselves with less certainty. My mother's typically perfect appearance showed subtle signs of distraction, her scarf slightly askew, her usually meticulous manicure showing minor chips. My father, always the embodiment of confident authority, moved with a hesitation I'd never witnessed before. Their vulnerability struck me unexpectedly. For the first time, I saw them not as the all-powerful arbiters of my childhood, but as aging individuals facing genuine challenges. This perception didn't erase the patterns of our relationship, but it added dimension to my understanding of them. "Thank you for meeting with us," my father said as they settled across from me, his customary commanding tone noticeably subdued. "Of course," I replied, signaling to the server for additional coffee. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss matters directly." Once we'd ordered, my mother's hands trembling slightly as she lifted her cup, my father cleared his throat. "Olivia, we've spent considerable time reflecting on our recent interactions," he began. "Our approach was less than optimal. From anyone else, this might have constituted a genuine apology. From my father, acknowledged paragon of precision, in all matters financial and personal, it represented unprecedented concession. We've begun implementing some of your suggestions," my mother added, her voice steadier than her hands. "The house listing goes live on Monday. Our agent believes it will sell quickly, possibly above asking price given the neighborhood demand." I nodded, maintaining neutral engagement rather than rushing to fill silence or ease tension. Lauren's guidance echoed in my mind. Allow space for new patterns rather than reflexively accommodating old ones. "What options are you considering for your next home?" I asked, focusing on practical matters before addressing emotional ones. My father produced a tablet, opening a real estate application displaying properties in a suburban community 20 minutes outside Boston. Each listing showed modest homes, comfortable but significantly scaled down from their current residents. "These are within our projected budget based on sale proceeds and remaining investments," he explained. "The location offers proximity to quality medical facilities while reducing property tax burden considerably." I studied the listings, noting the careful selection reflected genuine engagement with financial reality rather than token compliance. Whatever had prompted this shift, whether financial necessity or genuine reflection, the movement toward sustainable planning was encouraging. "These look suitable," I acknowledged. "Have you visited any in person yet?" "3 so far," my mother replied. "We're scheduled to see 2 more this afternoon." She hesitated, then added something that revealed volumes about their evolving perspective. "We've been discussing what possessions are truly important to keep versus what might be better passed along now." This represented significant psychological adjustment. My parents' home contained decades of accumulated belongings, not just furniture and artwork, but the material symbols of their perceived success and status. Willingness to evaluate these attachments suggested deeper reflection than I had anticipated. As our conversation continued, I maintained the careful balance I'd established in advance. Engaged but not eager, supportive but not rescuing, present but not acquiescing. When my father tentatively raised the question of financial assistance for the transition period between homes, I was prepared with a clear, bounded response. "I've set aside an additional $30,000 to assist with moving expenses, and temporary housing if needed," I stated. "This brings my total contribution to $70,000, a significant amount that reflects my concern for your well-being while respecting my own financial boundaries." The figure wasn't arbitrary. I'd carefully calculated what I could provide without compromising the warehouse purchase, establishing a concrete limit rather than leaving the boundary ambiguous and therefore vulnerable to expansion. My father nodded slowly, neither expressing gratitude nor requesting more, simply acknowledging the parameters I'd established. My mother's response proved more revealing. "That's more generous than we expected after recent tensions," she said, genuine surprise evident in her tone. "Thank you, Olivia." Her reaction confirmed what I'd long suspected, but rarely articulated. My parents had consistently underestimated my capacity for balanced generosity. In their narrative, I was either compliant with their requests or selfishly withholding. The possibility of measured, boundaried support hadn't featured in their understanding of me. "I've always been willing to help within reasonable limits," I said quietly. "What I've resisted is open-ended responsibility or assistance that compromises my own stability." Something shifted in my mother's expression. a subtle realignment of perception that didn't constitute complete understanding, but suggested the beginning of reassessment. "Your sister mentioned you're considering purchasing a property," she said, changing the subject with characteristic abruptness. "Some kind of industrial space?" The question contained multiple layers: genuine inquiry mixed with implicit judgment of unconventional choices, tentative interest in my life alongside comparison with more traditional paths. "Yes, a warehouse conversion in Fort Point," I confirmed. "The building has historical significance and remarkable structural integrity. The renovation would create a living space that honors its industrial heritage while incorporating sustainable design principles." As I described the property, I found myself speaking with unapologetic enthusiasm, not seeking approval, but simply sharing something meaningful from my life. This represented its own quiet revolution in our family dynamics, where my choices had typically been presented with preemptive defensiveness or simply not shared at all. "It sounds creative," my mother offered, clearly stretching beyond her aesthetic comfort zone. "I'd be interested in seeing the plans sometime." The invitation for future engagement, however tentative, opened a door neither of us had approached in years. My father, less comfortable with emotional terrain, steered us back to practical matters. "Regarding the estate planning revisions," he began, his discomfort evident, "our attorney is preparing updated documents restoring your position. We acted hastily and inappropriately." "I appreciate that," I said, maintaining steady eye contact. "But I want to be clear that my boundaries and decisions aren't contingent on inheritance considerations. My help comes from care and connection, not expectation of future benefit." My father nodded, a fleeting expression crossing his face that I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps recognition of the transactional approach that had characterized his view of relationships, or possibly awareness of how that approach had shaped our connection. As our meeting concluded, no dramatic reconciliation occurred, no tearful embraces or profound apologies. Instead, something more subtle, but potentially more significant had emerged. The tentative foundation for a different type of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than established roles. Walking them to their car, I maintained the balanced presence I'd cultivated throughout our conversation. My mother hesitated before getting in, turning to me with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "This hasn't been easy for any of us," she said, "but I'm beginning to think perhaps it was necessary." The acknowledgement, however oblique, represented more genuine reflection than I'd witnessed from her in years. I nodded, neither rushing to reassure nor emphasizing difficulty. "Change rarely is easy," I replied, "but it can be valuable nonetheless." As they drove away, I felt neither triumphant nor depleted, simply centered in the knowledge that I had engaged authentically rather than automatically. Whatever developed from this point would be built on more honest foundation than our previous interactions. That afternoon, I met Ryan at the warehouse for a scheduled walkthrough with the contractor who would handle renovations if our offer was accepted. As we discussed structural modifications and preservation priorities, I found myself fully present in a way that had sometimes eluded me when family matters dominated my emotional landscape. "You seem different today," Ryan observed as we examined potential locations for support beams. "More here." His observation captured something essential. By establishing clear boundaries with my family, financial and emotional, I had reclaimed energy previously consumed by unresolved tensions and unmet expectations. That evening, I developed a structured approach to family engagement moving forward. Not a defensive strategy, but a thoughtful framework for maintaining the emerging healthier dynamic. First, I would communicate directly rather than through intermediaries, eliminating the triangulation that had characterized many family interactions when Madeline served as message carrier or interpreter. Second, I would maintain regular but limited contact, monthly dinners or calls that allowed connection without enmeshment, demonstrating ongoing care without sacrificing personal boundaries. Third, I would share aspects of my life authentically, but selectively, neither performing for approval nor withholding from resentment, but simply engaging as one adult to others. Fourth, I would provide clearly defined assistance when aligned with my values and capabilities, neither overextending, from guilt nor withholding from anger. Finally, I would release responsibility for my parents' emotional responses to these boundaries, recognizing their reactions reflected their own journey rather than my worth or adequacy. This framework wasn't rigid doctrine, but flexible guidance, principles, rather than rules, creating space for evolution while maintaining essential protection against old patterns. The following day, Madeline called, clearly having spoken with our parents about our meeting. "They said you were very reasonable," she began, surprise evident in her tone. "Dad mentioned you're helping with moving expenses?" "Yes," I confirmed, simply neither defending the amount nor seeking validation for my generosity. "That's, good," she said, clearly recalibrating her expectations of conflict. "I thought after everything that happened that I'd refuse any assistance?" I completed her thought. "That was never my position, Madeline. I've consistently offered bounded support within my means, not complete withdrawal." The silence that followed suggested she was processing this distinction, perhaps recognizing how family narratives about my selfishness had oversimplified my actual perspective. "I've been thinking," she said finally, "maybe we could coordinate efforts during their transition. I can handle most of the physical aspects, sorting belongings, managing the move, if you're covering some of the financial components." The proposal represented something unprecedented in our adult relationship: genuine collaboration rather than competition or comparison. Whether motivated by practical necessity or emerging insight, it offered opportunity for new patterns between us as well. "That seems like a balanced approach," I agreed. "I'd like that." As spring advanced toward summer, my parents progressed with their downsizing plans while Ryan and I finalized our offer on the warehouse. The parallel processes created interesting symmetry. One generation releasing attachments to unsuitable space, while another claimed territory aligned with current values and needs. The tentative new patterns established during our cafe meeting continued to develop, not without challenges but with noticeable difference from previous interactions. My parents occasionally tested boundaries, particularly around expectations, for my involvement in their transition, but responded to gentle reinforcement without the dramatic escalations that had characterized past conflicts. Most significantly, I found myself engaging from centered presence rather than reactive patterns. When old triggers emerged, my mother's subtle comparisons between my choices and Madeline's, my father's instinctive financial advice despite my professional success, I could acknowledge the familiar dynamic without being captured by it. Lauren had been right. Water doesn't argue with obstacles but simply finds its natural channel forward. By establishing clear internal alignment, I had created space for authentic engagement without sacrificing essential boundaries. The result wasn't perfect reconciliation but something potentially more valuable. Relationship based on reality rather than roles, connection that honored genuine needs rather than conditioned expectations. The family patterns established over decades hadn't disappeared, but they had lost their defining power. In their place, new possibilities were emerging, not dramatic transformation, but incremental shifts that honored both history and potential for change. This balanced perspective offered foundation for sustainable relationship, rather than momentary harmony purchased through self-sacrifice. May unfolded with unexpected harmony as our parallel transitions progressed. My parents' colonial home sold within 4 days of listing, well above asking price thanks to a bidding war among buyers drawn to the prestigious neighborhood. Meanwhile, our offer on the warehouse was accepted after brief negotiation, with closing scheduled for early July. The synchronicity of these events created a strange symmetry. As my parents prepared to release decades of accumulated possessions, Ryan and I began planning how to transform an industrial space into a home that would reflect our values and aesthetic. Both processes involved reimagining what constituted necessity versus excess, foundation versus ornament. One Saturday in mid-May, I received an unexpected text from my mother. "Going through your old bedroom today. Found some of your architectural sketches from high school. Quite remarkable. Would you like them?" The message contained multiple layers: acknowledgement of my early talent, recognition of my professional path, and an invitation to reclaim pieces of my history. More striking was what it didn't contain. No guilt about discarding my childhood items, no pressure to assist with the sorting process, simply an offering of connection around something meaningful. "Yes, I'd like them," I replied. "I could come by tomorrow afternoon if that works." Her response came quickly. "Perfect. Your father will be at a medical appointment. Perhaps we could have tea after I show you what I've found." The invitation for one-on-one interaction was unprecedented. Throughout my life, my father had served as buffer and interpreter between my mother and me, our direct conversations typically brief and superficial. This suggested evolving dynamics beyond the financial realm. The following afternoon, I arrived at my childhood home to find it transformed by the staging process. Personal items removed, furniture rearranged, walls repainted in neutral tones. The effect was disorienting. The familiar made suddenly unfamiliar, similar to how family relationships were shifting from established patterns to uncharted territory. My mother greeted me with uncharacteristic warmth, leading me to my old bedroom where neatly labeled boxes lined the walls. "These contain the items we thought you might want," she explained. "Everything else will be donated unless you indicate otherwise." The organization reflected both practical necessity and surprising thoughtfulness, rather than presenting the entire contents of my childhood for my management, a task that would have consumed days. She had curated what might hold genuine meaning. "I found these in your desk drawer," she said, retrieving a portfolio I hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. Inside were conceptual sketches of buildings I'd drawn as a teenager, preliminary explorations of the architectural career I would eventually pursue. The drawings were crude by my current professional standards, but showed clear foundational talent. Thoughtful consideration of how structures interact with surroundings, innovative approaches to sustainable materials, attention to how built environments shape human experience. More surprising than the sketches themselves was my mother's engagement with them. "This one particularly caught my attention," she said, pointing to a concept for a community arts center integrated into natural landscape. "The way you incorporated existing trees into the design rather than removing them. You were considering environmental impact even then." Her observation demonstrated attention I'd never believed she'd given my early creative efforts. Throughout my teenage years, my artistic pursuits had seemed invisible against the backdrop of Madeline's more conventional achievements. Yet here was evidence that my mother had noticed, perhaps not understood or prioritized, but at least registered. "I don't remember showing these to you," I said carefully. She arranged the sketches on the desk, avoiding my gaze. "You didn't. I found them once when cleaning your room during your freshman year of college. I was surprised by their sophistication." The revelation opened space for questions I'd never dared ask directly. "Were you and Dad disappointed when I chose architecture instead of business or law?" My mother's hands stilled on the papers. "Your father was concerned about financial stability in a creative field," she said after a moment. I was uncertain what it meant. Our generation viewed careers differently. Security first, passion secondary. Her answer wasn't complete, vindication or dramatic apology, but it offered something more valuable: context for understanding how their limitations had shaped our relationship. Their dismissal of my chosen path hadn't stemmed solely from favoritism toward Madeline, but from genuine inability to comprehend priorities different from their own. As we continued exploring the carefully sorted boxes, more layers of our complex history emerged. My mother had preserved achievements I thought long forgotten: academic awards, writing competition certificates, newspaper clippings mentioning my undergraduate design projects. The collection suggested more attention than I'd ever perceived, albeit attention never directly expressed. "You've kept more than I expected," I observed as we moved to the kitchen for tea. My mother measured leaves into the teapot with practiced precision. "Perhaps I've been better at preserving evidence of your accomplishments than acknowledging them directly," she said, the admission clearly difficult. "Expression doesn't come easily to me, Olivia. It never has." The statement wasn't excuse but explanation, offering insight into emotional constraints I'd interpreted as rejection throughout childhood. Her reticence hadn't been exclusive to me, but represented broader limitation in emotional articulation, though certainly exacerbated by family dynamics that positioned Madeline's more conventional choices as inherently more valuable. "I've found a house," she said as we sat at the kitchen island, changing subjects with characteristic abruptness. "Your father is viewing it tomorrow, but I think it will suit our needs." She showed me photographs on her tablet. A modest single-level home in a comfortable suburb, its contemporary design suggesting recent construction with modern efficiency standards. "It's considerably smaller than this place," she continued. "But that's becoming appealing rather than concerning. Less to maintain, lower utility costs. No stairs for your father's knees." Her practical assessment reflected genuine engagement with changing circumstances rather than reluctant compromise. Something fundamental had shifted in her orientation, from resistance to adaptation, from denial to acceptance. "The location seems ideal," I offered, noting the property's proximity to medical facilities and community amenities. "There's something else?" she added, hesitation in her voice. "It's only 20 minutes from your warehouse. Not that I expect frequent visits, but—" The implied desire for geographic connection, tentative but unmistakable, represented significant evolution in our relationship. Throughout my adult life, physical distance had seemed mutual preference rather than circumstance, visits occurring through obligation rather than desire. "That would make coordination easier during your transition," I acknowledged, meeting her halfway in this careful exploration of potential closer relationship. We discussed practical aspects of their impending move, timing, logistics, division of responsibilities between family members. The conversation flowed with unexpected ease, focused on solutions rather than grievances, possibilities rather than limitations. As I prepared to leave, my mother handed me a sealed envelope. "Your father and I have been discussing our estate planning with a new advisor," she said. "This outlines the current arrangements, which she assures us are more equitable and transparent than previous versions." I accepted the envelope without opening it. "Thank you for the information, but as I've said before, my relationship with you isn't contingent on inheritance considerations." "I understand that," she replied. "This isn't meant as leverage, but as transparency, addressing past mistakes directly rather than avoiding them." The distinction was meaningful, not using potential future assets to influence current behavior, but acknowledging previous inequities as part of rebuilding trust. The approach suggested growing recognition of our relationship as connection between adults rather than obligation between parent and child. Driving home with boxes of rediscovered history, I felt neither triumphant nor vindicated, but surprisingly peaceful. The afternoon had offered no dramatic revelations or profound apologies, but something potentially more valuable: insight into the complex humans behind parental roles I'd simplified throughout my life. That evening, Ryan helped me sort through the recovered artifacts of my development. Together, we examined early design concepts, academic achievements, and formative influences that had shaped my professional journey. It's strange, I reflected as we organized materials. Seeing my development through preserved evidence rather than memory creates a different narrative than the one I've carried. How so? Ryan asked, examining an award certificate from a high school sustainability competition. The story I've told myself was one of complete invisibility, talent unrecognized, achievements unacknowledged. But these items suggest more complex reality. I gestured toward the carefully preserved documentation. Someone was paying attention, even if they never expressed it effectively. This realization didn't erase decades of emotional neglect or justify disparate treatment between Madeline and me. But it added dimension to simplified narrative I'd constructed, not erasing legitimate grievances, but placing them within broader context of flawed humans doing imperfect best within their own limitations. The following week brought practical application of our emerging collaborative approach to family matters. My parents required temporary housing between selling their colonial and closing on their new property. Rather than assuming Madeline would accommodate them as originally planned, my father called to discuss options. We've found an extended stay residence near the new house, he explained. Fully furnished, month-to-month lease, designed for people in transition. Using your contribution toward moving expenses will cover the cost without financial strain. His approach demonstrated multiple shifts: consulting rather than announcing, presenting solution rather than problem, utilizing resources within established boundaries rather than seeking additional support. Most significantly, he acknowledged my contribution without diminishing its importance or treating it as obligatory. That sounds like an excellent arrangement, I replied, appreciating both the practical solution and the respectful communication. Your mother mentioned you visited last weekend, he continued, venturing into emotional territory that typically made him uncomfortable. She found it valuable. The careful word choice revealed his continued difficulty with direct emotional expression, but the effort itself demonstrated evolution, attempting connection despite discomfort, acknowledging relationship beyond, practical coordination. I did too, I said simply, neither demanding more explicit acknowledgement nor rejecting his limited articulation. As May turned to June, this emerging pattern consolidated. Not dramatic transformation, but incremental, shifts toward healthier interaction. My parents consulted rather than demanded, acknowledged contributions rather than assumed them, expressed appreciation in their limited way rather than expecting sacrifice without recognition. Madeline, too, demonstrated evolving perspective. During a Sunday brunch at her home, an invitation I might once have declined from self-protection, she made observation that suggested genuine reflection. I've been thinking about what you said regarding disproportionate family support, she began as we sat on her patio watching her children play. At first, I dismissed it as exaggeration, but looking back more objectively. She paused, visibly uncomfortable with this territory. I can see how resource allocation appeared unbalanced, even if I didn't perceive it that way at the time. The acknowledgement wasn't complete recognition of privilege or dramatic apology for past advantages, but it represented genuine effort to see beyond established family narrative, the beginning of perspective-taking rather than defensive denial. Thank you for saying that, I replied, accepting the partial recognition without demanding fuller accounting. Our conversation shifted to practical coordination of parental transition, her managing physical logistics while I handled financial arrangements and documentation. The collaborative approach felt neither forced nor false, but natural evolution, of relationship based on adult reality rather than childhood patterns. By late June, multiple elements of transition were proceeding simultaneously, my parents preparing for their downsizing move, Ryan and I finalizing renovation plans for the warehouse, and family relationships continuing their careful recalibration toward healthier dynamics. The momentum felt not like dramatic reinvention, but organic evolution. Small adjustments accumulating into meaningful change, not erasing history, but building upon it more constructively. The process wasn't seamless or without occasional regression into familiar patterns, but the trajectory remained consistent, toward relationship based on mutual respect rather than established hierarchy. Most significantly, I found myself engaging from centered authenticity rather than reactive patterns, neither accommodating from habit nor resisting from resentment, but responding from integrated sense of personal truth. This foundation allowed genuine connection without sacrificing essential boundaries, creating space for relationship that honored both past influence and present autonomy. The momentum building wasn't toward perfect reconciliation or complete healing of historical wounds. Rather, it moved toward something more realistic and potentially more valuable. Family connection that acknowledged both limitations and possibilities, neither idealized nor rejected, but accepted in its complex, imperfect reality. In early July, just as multiple transitions were progressing smoothly, an unexpected complication emerged. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing construction permits for the warehouse renovation. A message from my uncle, Robert, my father's older brother who had maintained minimal contact with our family over the decades. Olivia, I understand your parents are selling their home due to financial difficulties. As trustee of your grandmother's estate, I'm concerned about potential mismanagement of family resources. Could we meet to discuss this situation? I'll be in Boston next week on business. The message was characteristic of Uncle Robert. Direct, to the point of bluntness, focused on financial matters, and containing implicit judgment. A successful corporate attorney in Chicago, he had always positioned himself as the financial authority in the extended family, despite limited involvement in our lives beyond occasional holiday visits. I hadn't seen him in nearly 5 years, not since my grandmother's funeral, where he had presided over arrangements with clinical efficiency. His sudden interest in my parents' financial situation seemed peculiar, particularly given their historically strained relationship. After consulting briefly with Ryan, I agreed to meet Robert at his hotel during his Boston visit, curious about his concerns, but wary of his potential impact on our family's delicate progress. The following Thursday, I arrived at the upscale downtown hotel where Robert had arranged for us to meet in the executive lounge. At 65, he remained imposing, tall and rigid in his bespoke suit, silver hair precisely cut, expression perpetually evaluating. He rose as I approached, offering a formal handshake rather than familial embrace. Olivia, you're looking well. Professional success clearly agrees with you. His greeting was typical, acknowledging achievement rather than personal connection, assessing value through external metrics. Thank you for making time, I replied, matching his professional tone. Your message mentioned concerns about my parents' situation. Robert signaled for coffee before addressing my implied question. I've been monitoring your father's financial decisions for years. Not interfering, simply observing. The recent property sale triggered notification through family trust parameters. This was new information. I hadn't been aware of any family trust structures connecting my father's financial activities to Robert's oversight. What exactly is your concern? I asked directly. The precipitous nature of their downsizing suggests poor planning or potential exploitation, he replied. Your grandmother's trust was established with specific provisions regarding family asset protection. If your parents are liquidating property due to mismanagement or external pressure, trustee intervention may be warranted. His implication was clear. He suspected my involvement in my parents' financial decisions represented potential exploitation rather than assistance. My parents are making autonomous choices based on realistic assessment of their circumstances, I stated, maintaining professional composure despite the offensive suggestion. Their decision to downsize reflects practical adaptation to retirement. Realities and healthcare costs. Robert's expression remained skeptical. Your sister indicated they approached you for substantial financial assistance you were initially reluctant to provide. Now suddenly they're selling the family home and purchasing property conveniently near your new residence. Madeline's involvement surprised me momentarily before I recognized the pattern. She had likely responded to Robert's inquiries without considering potential implications, simply sharing family information as she often did without regard for privacy boundaries. My parents requested financial support beyond my reasonable capacity to provide, I clarified. I offered assistance within appropriate boundaries while encouraging sustainable solutions to their underlying challenges. Their housing decisions reflect independent consideration of options, including proximity to medical facilities appropriate for my father's condition. Robert studied me with the evaluative gaze I remembered from childhood, the expression that had always made me feel like a witness under cross-examination rather than a family member. Your architectural firm has been quite successful, he observed. Director of Operations by 34 is impressive. One might reasonably expect someone in your position could provide more substantial family support. The statement perfectly encapsulated Robert's worldview. Financial capability automatically created obligation, particularly within family structures. The perspective was remarkably similar to my parents' initial position, though articulated with legal precision rather than emotional expectation. My professional success reflects years of self-funded education and career development, I replied evenly. My financial responsibilities include substantial student loans, business investment obligations, and personal long-term security planning. These factors inform reasonable boundaries regarding family assistance. Our conversation continued. In this vein, Robert probing for evidence of undue influence or exploitation, me calmly defending the legitimacy of both my parents' decisions and my own boundaries. The exchange remained superficially civil while carrying undercurrents of accusation and defense. I'm considering a formal assessment visit, he finally stated. As trustee, I have fiduciary responsibility to ensure family resources aren't being compromised through manipulation or pressure. The implied accusation stiffened my resolve. You're certainly entitled to visit family members, I responded. However, I should clarify that my parents' decisions have been made with professional financial counsel, thorough consideration of options, and complete autonomy. Any suggestion otherwise mischaracterizes both their agency and my involvement. Robert's expression revealed nothing. Nevertheless, I'll be arranging a visit within the next few weeks. Family trust provisions require trustee evaluation when significant asset liquidation occurs under potentially concerning circumstances. After our meeting concluded, I sat alone in the hotel lobby, processing this unexpected complication. Robert's intervention represented external opposition that could potentially disrupt the fragile new patterns emerging in our family relationships. That evening, I called my father directly, something that would have been unthinkable months earlier, but now felt appropriate given the situation. I met with Uncle Robert today, I began after brief greetings. He expressed concerns about your financial decisions and mentioned potential trustee intervention. I thought you should be aware. My father's extended silence confirmed my suspicion that Robert's involvement was unwelcome rather than requested. Robert has always believed his law degree grants him authority over family matters, he finally said, resignation clear in his tone. The trustee position was largely ceremonial, my mother's attempt to acknowledge his need for control without granting substantial power. The trust itself contains minimal assets at this point. He mentioned planning a formal assessment visit regarding your property decisions, I added. My father sighed audibly. Of course he is. Robert has questioned every significant financial decision I've made since we were children. His involvement now is predictable, if unwelcome. The conversation revealed another dimension of family, dynamics I hadn't fully appreciated. the competitive relationship between my father and his older brother that had shaped my father's approach to financial matters and perhaps influenced his parenting as well. The pattern of judgment and evaluation Robert had directed toward me was apparently familiar territory for my father as well. "How would you like to handle this?" I asked, consciously positioning us as allies rather than adversaries in this situation. The question itself represented significant evolution in our relationship, consulting his preference rather than imposing solution, acknowledging his agency rather than assuming control. "Robert responds exclusively to documentation and formal presentation," my father replied after consideration. "If you're willing, a coordinated approach might be most efficient, presenting unified explanation of decisions made and actions taken." His suggestion of collaboration rather than either rejection of my involvement or expectation of my resolving the situation independently demonstrated how far our relationship had progressed. Over the following week, my father and I developed a comprehensive overview of the financial decisions made, including professional advisor recommendations, healthcare cost projections, and property market analysis. The process was surprisingly productive, his financial expertise complementing my organizational skills, our previously contentious relationship temporarily set aside in favor of common purpose. My mother, observing our collaboration with evident surprise, eventually contributed her own insights regarding lifestyle considerations and practical household management factors. The resulting documentation provided clear, factual justification for decisions made without defensive posturing or emotional appeals. When Robert arrived for his assessment visit in late July, he encountered not vulnerable, manipulated relatives, but a unified family presentation of carefully considered choices. My parents hosted him at their temporary residence, with Madeline and me both present by mutual agreement. "We appreciate your concern for our financial well-being," my father began, utilizing the practiced professional tone from his banking career. "We've prepared comprehensive documentation of recent decisions and their rationale for your review." Robert clearly hadn't anticipated this coordinated response. His expected role as authoritative evaluator was undermined by our prepared presentation and unified stance. As he reviewed the materials, his expression shifted from skeptical authority to reluctant recognition. The documentation demonstrated not desperate capitulation to crisis, but proactive adaptation to changing circumstances, exactly the kind of strategic adjustment his own legal and financial mindset would typically endorse. "The analysis appears thorough," he finally acknowledged, "though I might have recommended more aggressive investment rebalancing rather than property liquidation as initial response." This represented significant concession from Robert, whose typical approach involved identifying flaws rather than acknowledging adequacy. "We considered multiple approaches," my father responded with unexpected confidence. "Our financial advisor presented various scenarios, including the investment restructuring you mentioned. The property decision offered most immediate overhead reduction while preserving core assets." Their exchange continued, two financially oriented brothers discussing strategies and approaches with professional respect rather than personal competition. The dynamic revealed another layer of family history I hadn't fully appreciated: how Robert's perpetual judgment had shaped my father's defensiveness, which had subsequently influenced his parenting approach. As the meeting concluded, Robert's assessment had evolved from suspicious intervention to reluctant acknowledgement of reasonable decision-making. His final comment, directed primarily to my father but inclusive of all present, revealed subtle shift in perception. "Your approach demonstrates more strategic foresight than I anticipated," he stated with characteristic formality. "As trustee, I see no basis for concern regarding decision-making capacity or external manipulation." The statement represented significant vindication, though delivered without warmth or personal connection. Robert operated exclusively in realms of assessment and evaluation, his engagement with family fundamentally transactional rather than relational. After his departure, an unexpected moment of connection occurred between my father and me. Shared recognition of similar experiences with Robert's judgmental oversight. "He's always been like that," my father said, fatigue evident in his voice. "Evaluating rather than understanding, assessing rather than supporting." The comment offered insight into my father's own developmental context, how growing up under constant evaluation had shaped his approach to achievement, recognition, and family dynamics. While not excusing the patterns he had perpetuated with me, this glimpse of his formative experiences created space for compassion alongside accountability. "Thank you for your help with this," he added, the gratitude awkward but genuine. "Your organizational skills made significant difference in presenting our case effectively." The acknowledgement, simple but unprecedented, represented meaningful evolution in our relationship. For perhaps the first time, my father had recognized my contribution as valuable on its own terms, rather than measuring it against expectations or standards. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how external opposition had unexpectedly strengthened our family's emerging collaboration. Robert's intervention, intended to identify dysfunction, had instead catalyzed cooperation based on shared purpose rather than established roles. This experience demonstrated how family systems often resist change, not just from within, but through extended networks that maintain established patterns. Robert's automatic assumption of exploitation rather than collaboration revealed how deeply entrenched the perception of my secondary status had become in family narrative. Yet our unified response had effectively challenged this external reinforcement of old dynamics. By presenting coordinated factual explanation rather than defensive justification, we had begun rewriting not just our internal relationships, but how our family functioning was perceived by others. The external opposition had provided unexpected opportunity to practice new patterns under pressure, maintaining boundaries while offering support, collaborating without sacrificing autonomy, presenting unified perspective while honoring individual contributions. These skills would serve us well in navigating whatever challenges emerged next in our evolving family landscape. Most significantly, the experience demonstrated how my own internal changes had created space for external evolution. By maintaining centered presence rather than reactive patterns when faced with Robert's accusations, I had enabled productive response rather than defensive escalation. This balanced approach had allowed genuine collaboration without sacrificing the boundaries essential to continued growth. The warehouse closing was scheduled for the second week of August. As the date approached, I found myself navigating an unexpected internal conflict. On the surface, everything was proceeding well. My parents had completed their home sale and were preparing to close on their new property. Madeline and I were cooperating effectively on family matters, and Ryan and I had finalized renovation, plans for our future home. Yet beneath these external successes, a subtle but persistent disquiet had emerged. Each night, I would wake around 3 a.m., my mind racing with fragmented concerns that seemed impossible to resolve in daylight hours. One particularly restless night, I slipped from bed without waking Ryan and moved to the living room window overlooking the city skyline. Boston at night had always brought me clarity, the geometric precision of illuminated architecture against darkness creating perspective that daily chaos often obscured. As I stood watching occasional cars navigate empty streets, I finally acknowledged the internal conflict I'd been avoiding. Despite the positive evolution in family relationships, part of me remained deeply wary of genuine reconciliation. This reluctance wasn't about forgiveness or lingering resentment. Rather, it stemmed from recognition that meaningful connection with my family would require vulnerability I had systematically eliminated from our interactions. The carefully constructed, professional persona that had served me well in managing family dynamics also created emotional distance that prevented authentic relationship. For decades, I had protected myself by transforming hurt into competence, rejection into self-sufficiency, longing for recognition into evidence of achievement. This strategy had been necessary for survival within family patterns that consistently devalued my emotional needs. But the armor that had protected me now prevented the connection that might be possible in our evolving relationship. The following morning, I shared these reflections with Ryan as we prepared breakfast. I've become so practiced at maintaining boundaries that I'm not sure I know how to create openings, I admitted, setting coffee mugs on our small kitchen island. The professional distance feels safe, but it also limits potential connection. Ryan considered this thoughtfully. There's a difference between boundaries and barriers, he observed. Boundaries define what's acceptable. Barriers prevent engagement entirely. Maybe what you're sensing is the need to adjust from the latter to the former. His distinction resonated powerfully. The protective barriers I'd constructed had been essential during earlier phases of family interaction, when any vulnerability was inevitably exploited within established patterns. But as those patterns evolved, rigidly maintained barriers might prevent the very changes I claimed to seek. The question, Ryan continued as he prepared eggs, is whether you actually want closer connection with your family, or if you're responding to social expectations about what family relationships should be. His question cut to the heart of my internal conflict. Did I genuinely desire deeper relationship with parents who had consistently prioritized my sister and diminished my needs? Or was I responding to cultural narratives about family reconciliation and forgiveness without examining my authentic desires? These questions accompanied me to a lunch meeting with Lauren that afternoon. As we discussed the warehouse renovation plans, I found myself sharing my internal struggle more directly than I'd intended. I've become exceptionally skilled at professional management of family dynamics, I explained, but I'm less certain about whether or how to create authentic connection beyond that. Lauren nodded, recognition in her expression. The protective strategies that help us survive difficult family systems often become limitations when those systems begin to change. The question becomes whether temporary adaptations have calcified into permanent identity. Her framing helped me recognize something essential: my competence in managing family dynamics, the strategic planning, clear communication, and bounded support had been survival adaptation rather than fundamental identity. Yet over time, this approach had expanded beyond family relationships, influencing my engagement in all emotional territories.